Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you our introduction to Squid Discipline Priest with this 20 Halls of Valor run with a very minimal amount of interrupts and the fortified bolstering affix coming at you. I wanted to use this dungeon as an opportunity to start going over how the spec is changing with the Squid Discipline, how it feels, what talents you're running with. If you'd like to see that, check the description as I'll have the talent hash there, as well as my guides on Wowhead, which are going to be updating throughout this week. And later on, we'll have a full fleshed out guide for M+, and a full fleshed out guide for rating with all of these new changes. But right now, I just wanted to take the time to start talking about how it feels, what's going on with the spec, how I'm playing it so far, what I like, dislike going into it. First and foremost, from the talent perspective, I really quickly found that I don't really like mind games. With the double charge, which was not documented on the patch notes, but Dark Indulgence allowing you to have 2 charges of Mind Blast and having the reduced mana cost, it's something we featured in our last video, did actually end up going live. And as a result, it feels like you don't really have much opportunity, much opening to use lots of mind games. And that is mainly because of the fact that Mind Blast is so efficient to use. You're consuming damage from Purge the Wicked early with Expiation, which is also buffing your Mind Blast damage. You're able to reduce the cooldown of your Mindbender, and you're able to extend its duration while active, thanks to all the Mindbender the Squid resources. Their Mindbender will have a glyph that'll kind of turn it into a little squidling. That's why it's called Squid Build, for those of you who don't know. I wanted to go through this Halls of Valor run because it's more of a pug run. There are a lot of missed interrupts, and it kind of gives the opportunity for the spec to experience that triage healing that you have once more. Some of the early talent builds that we were talking about, I wasn't sure if I'd even run things like Bright Pupil, but after the Radiance buff that we had recently received, 100% more healing out of Radiance, you're able to hit people for such a high amount of healing that it doesn't really ever come into question of should I use more or less Radiance. You just want to slam it all the time because it is that powerful. It is that efficient. When it comes to the overall, like, how do you set up, how do you deal damage, how do you get yourself together, I will pool up my Mind Blast charges for when I have Mindbender out. And so whenever I have Mindbender out, I'll almost immediately slam down a Mind Blast instantly. I always want to make sure, since Mind Blast is a hasted cooldown, that you're going to get a lot of cooldown reduction from Lust, from Power Infusion. Whenever you have both of them up, you're going to get so much extended duration and so much reduced cooldown out of your Mindbender that, as you can see, I had about 17-18 seconds of uptime, and then I almost immediately get my Mindbender back again and ready to use. And this allows the spec to sort of flow between having Mindbender up and having Solace on hand so that you're constantly regenning mana. The spec still consumes mana like a hog, but you are able to regenerate that mana at such a high rate compared to other specs in the game at the moment, because your Mindbender, your Solace are all really working in conjunction to help each other out and make your life a lot easier. From my own talents, I had a bunch of questions about this today as to whether or not I wanted to run like Exaltation for like a longer lasting Rapture. And this is why I wanted to do the +20 Keystone, was because I find that things that'll work out in a 15 environment or a 17 environment, they really can quickly fall off. And then people have to kind of like learn an entire new build on like how to play the spec. And so I think Exaltation is very similar in that regard, in that you'll be able to shield through entire mechanics. You'll be able to shield through the dot damage of the Infernals in Ruby Life Pools. You'll be able to shield through the storm damage out of Hirja. But then you sort of hit a point at a high enough key level that the shields can't carry you the entire way. And that's where I think at a 20 level, you can really quickly notice that. And so that way you're forced to make sure that you're shielding just to set yourself up and to protect yourself. And then later on is when you're going to focus on just brute force healing it. So learning how to brute force heal it, I think, is always going to be really important. Some of the changes that they made to Halls of Valor recently was nerfing down Solstin and who was his buddy, Olmir. These are like the mini bosses before Hirja. With this, the storms still do pump quite a lot of damage. And this is going to be the same sort of like setup that I have leading into the Hirja fight itself. I'm going to make sure I'm aggressively taking advantage of my Shadow Covenant, my Mind Blast charges, trying to have Mindbender up as well. Mindbender's damage is not really influenced or buffed by any of the recent changes. It's always kind of done the same. But the big reason for why you want to run it is that all your other resources are synergizing so well with it to give extra duration, to give extra uptime, that it makes it a lot easier to run something like that because it's giving you mana, it's giving you a little bit of consistent output on hand. It's adding a really large amount of damage, especially in an AoE environment, to the point that some of these pug runs I was doing that were not depletes, where you're like 25, 27, maybe getting close to 30k in terms of overall damage, because your dot effects are strong, your Mindbender cleave is really strong, you have a lot of resources to be able to pump large amounts of damage. And since the many change, where it's almost just a straight up 10% damage buff through the Sins of the Many changed from 30 to 40%, you have so much power on hand to work with. When it came to Hirja, our first round on this boss, we kind of over-empowered her and ended up wiping as a result. So this is going to be the second round that we had going into the boss, where, again, it's about sort of setting the stage and setting up your output. And so being able to have things like Power Infusion and having your Mindbender rolling help out a lot. Your Radiance charges actually give you such a huge bounce back effect and bounce back resource that you could utilize. And I often found that I was able to very quickly and effectively take advantage of both charges of both charges of Mind Blast to be able to pump really consistent output. One of the talents I haven't talked about yet is Painful Punishment, which gives you multiple charges of pain suppression. This is really good on a Fortified and Bolster week, for obvious reasons, but it's also really good for dealing with tyrannical boss encounters. When you have to deal with a fight like Hirja, for example, sometimes you'll sort of hit a peak for tank survivability, where they'll almost always just be able to survive all the things on their own without relying on externals at certain key levels. You'll see this in Hirja, as well as like the second boss out of Ruby Life Pools, which does a lot of tank buster damage. Sometimes your tanks will need externals on these boss fights, but in a lot of key levels, they don't. And this is where you sort of have a tank external sort of lingering for a long time. Now when you have Painful Punishment, pain suppression just gets better and better because it's a resource that you can leverage for yourself to be able to help mitigate more damage. When you're using it in conjunction with frequent shielding, as well as just shielding any of the targets that are getting hit by the Expel Light on a fight like Hirja, or shielding your tank through the tank damage, taking advantage of Rapture before the storms start, you can actually net a decent amount of cooldown reduction for your pain suppression to utilize on yourself or somebody else that's squishy, and then be able to really take advantage of it in that area, while also pooling up resources or getting cooldown reduction to use it on your tank for some of the advanced trash pulls that happen a little bit later. So it's a nice bit of flexibility that Disc is able to have on hand, and it's almost, let's say almost, like you're able to have an extra sort of like immunity or external. Because whenever you're looking at healing really high keys, where Disc kind of struggles is that they can't priority target heal really well, they sort of heal everybody equally. You can have your defensive penance that you can utilize, you can have, barrier, pain suppression, now you have a second charge of that, and it kind of allows you to smooth out all the damage that everybody takes, because when some classes like rogues or warlocks have really strong defensives, you'll then see that other people need massive priority healing, and that can work pretty well for a holy priest, because that's a lot of what they can do in keys. But when it comes to Disc's playstyle, you got like your defensive penance and not a whole lot else on the back burner. So this is where having lots of damage reduction and absorb effects can smooth everything out, equalize everything out, and provide some very considerable advantage for you going forward. Next up, I wanted to fast forward on to Fenrir, as in many cases, and a lot of my other high keys have been quite spoiled by group composition. Being able to consistently have people who are able to immune the leaps, and I thought it'd be a good opportunity to talk about all the changes that Fenrir's received to be able to provide a realistic picture for how everyone's going to be healing it. Once again, I'm dropping my Mindbender really rapidly, consuming all of my charges of Mind Blast. You can even rip an early Shadow or Death to get extra duration if you really wanted to. Those are okay, but often I'll pretty much just be pumping out extra smites, extra penances, whatever it is that I can do, because those smites are also going to be reducing the cooldown of your Mind Vendor, bringing it back faster for you. Keep in mind that the dot effects from Fenrir's Leaps are actually going to fall off, and you can utilize these as a cooldown of sorts for the Ravenous Leap. When you see that the dots are going to be falling off, when you see that they are almost expired, that's an indicator for you to know, hey, there's going to be another leap coming, and you can start kind of pre-spreading on hand for that. Gives you a bit more predictable of a window as to when that's going to be able to happen. And this is also giving you an opportunity to know when to stack up for that Claw Frenzy. So after the Descent of Blood, you have to deal with Claw Frenzies. After the dots are expired, you have to deal with the Ravenous Leaps. This makes it just a lot easier to be able to overall predict the damage that's going to be happening for you. And it's still going to be an area where you're going to want to Bloodlust, you're wanting to pop big cooldowns, you're wanting to make sure you don't cleave with other people. But Disc's mana feels so much better. I was even doing a Shadow Moon Burial Ground, and the last boss took like 3 minutes. We were kind of dropping puddles on top of the raid the entire time. And I had a really similar experience where I felt like I was able to sustain 60, 70k HPS without burning through my mana. Because the extended duration of Mind Benders, regenning mana, Solace is bringing your Bender back more rapidly through the Void Summoner talent, and it's regenning a lot of mana for you. So these resources all really work well, all really work hand in hand. Some of the challenges I was finding was I found that a lot of my damage comes from Purge the Wicked and Expiation, but it's tough to be able to take advantage of Twilight Equilibrium. Revel in Purity and then like Painful Punishment are really powerful damage over time buffs, but they're also kind of point heavy for what they do. And it's not difficult to weave Twilight Equilibrium. It's just something you kind of have to keep in the back of your mind rolling throughout these dungeon runs, especially because you consume a lot of Purge the Wicked through Expiation, through Mind Blast casts. You have to refresh it a lot, and it's an easy holy spell to take advantage of. But it's also just kind of a challenge to figure out what talent points that you want to drop. And it really feels like the Squid build for a 5-man environment has a lot of opportunities to drop 1 point and get another, but it seems like the price can be kind of high. And so that also puts a lot of pressure on you to make sure you're taking advantage of certain resources. Things like Barrier and Pain Suppression feels like they're just mandatory. You have to take them all the time. You have to utilize them all the time. But if you're not utilizing them, there's other passive effects that are also very good. And so that, I think, you have a lot more pressure on in general is, where are you going to be using Pain Suppression or Barrier throughout the dungeon regularly to make sure that you're getting value out of them? Because even though there's a 2-charge system for Pain Sup where you can kind of pool up a second one and use whenever, you might have some really challenging boss pull or trash pull where you're using both the charges in quick succession or back-to-back or whatever that you have. But you have to make sure that there's other areas you're taking advantage of it in the dungeons. And one of the best ways to do it, really, is not when a tank is calling for it. It's mainly for when you can ignore the tank, not worry about the tank, and instead be able to heal them by dealing damage and not have to actively spend a lot of time healing them. One thing I neglected to mention until now is Vamp Embrace. Since that's off the global cooldown, you're really easily able to use it all the time with Shadow Covenant. I'm kind of debating just macroing it into Shadow Covenant and just seeing how that's going to work out for me. Although I know having the control over Vamp Embrace is always going to be nice. Vamp Embrace was doing, I think, like 100, 150k per cast, and there were definitely more casts I could have utilized with the spell. It's also surprising, honestly, how much healing that Shadow Covenant is just generally able to do through its own cast. It's kind of easy to forget about sometimes. But now Disc has a lot of non-damage, non-atonement output. Radiance on its own, I think, was like 15, 16% of my overall throughout some of these dungeon runs. Yeah, it was like 15, 16%. And it was just casting Radiance when there's damage. So there's these interesting ways that Disc can actually be a lot more reactive to damage than it otherwise was previously. And so this gives you more mana efficiency. It allows you to be able to be really aggressive with your resources and not have to feel like you have to drink every single pull all the time. Now, the responsibility, though, is for you to play around Mindbender and extend its duration, and to be using Solace very aggressively. So this makes the build really high APM and you have a lot to track as well. Having to look at both charges of Mind Blast and the charges of Pain Suppression, and looking at Solace, and keeping Shield on cooldown, and having Purge the Wicked rolling and spreading to a variety of targets. There is a lot of button bloat going on with the spec at the moment. It's fun, but I can't be the only one that's kind of wishing for a reduction in the amount of keys that we have to press to be able to operate it cleanly. It's very fun. I enjoy it a lot. I've been having a lot of fun with it, but there's certainly that extra bit of challenge that they have on hand. Taking a look at some of the overalls that we had for the dungeon, we did not time this one as well. We were a couple minutes over, I think, on that Halls 20 that we had. Chill Globe, I used 29 times, but 18 of them resulted in damage, so I did get a decent amount of mana regen out of it. Mindbender, as we mentioned before, is not massive damage on its own, but the Inescapable Torment, unfortunately, is only converting into healing off of one enemy hit, but its damage overall is still really nice to see. You can actually cast a heap of Mind Blast, and it's so efficient to be able to do so because of the cooldown reduction that we had mentioned previously, because of the extended duration for your Mindbender. Mind Blast went from one of your least efficient abilities to one of your most, so it results in tons of damage. Keep in mind, the expiation damage that you're doing is resulting from Purge the Wicked application. So maintaining Purge the Wicked and spreading Purge the Wicked is still of tantamount importance. Shadow Covenant is kind of a challenging spell to be able to properly use or constantly use, because it's a damage amp, because you like using it before damage, because it also heals. There's a lot of conflict that happens within this ability, but it's just like a better schism at this point, and it should be used very frequently. I believe I only used 13 Vamp Embraces throughout that last dungeon. I think I only used a similar amount of Pain Suppressions. And so as we get into higher level content and as we get into more challenging keys, those are some areas where I need to be able to pick those casts up and continue using them a lot more aggressively. And we'll make sure that we bump up the size that we have here. Atonement is back, still doing about 40% of your overall. I heard people like poo-pooing on disc shields, and I don't get it. Shields are really good. I only activated like 7 Raptures in this dungeon or something like that. Yeah, you can see right here, I only use Rapture 7 times throughout the dungeon, and I'm still averaging something like 75k of shield per cast out of shield in this instance. With how aggressively and how frequently that you're taking advantage of Penance, both Penance and Dark Reprimand, they're doing almost the exact same amount of damage, by the way. I'm having about 150, 160 casts in total between the two, and I'm so easily able to use it to amplify the power of my shields from my 4 set that it's a wonderful spell to take advantage of. It's wonderful to just slam shield onto your tank frequently. Hell, you can even like preemptively rapture your party going into like challenging pulls where, you know, casts can be going off. But shield is wonderful. Shield works so well, especially when you're beefing up the damage of your Dark Reprimand with the host of other damage amplifiers that you have at your disposal. It's working really well. Mind Games, I just struggle to be able to cast it enough in dungeons because you have so many other spells to be able to utilize. That was something I touched on before. I think I'm probably just going to drop it going into the future, but I wanted to be able to at least have that conversation with you guys early on. From a talent option perspective, you can pretty easily drop Words of the Pious since you're not getting nearly as many smite casts as you used to, because like I said, there's just so many other good things to cast. Yeah, I got to cast 100 of those smites, but I'm also casting almost 200 Mind Blasts, 200 Purge the Wickeds, about 150 Penances all over this really lengthy dungeon that you have. Still a very big believer in all the Shadow or Death talents. Obviously, you can take Disease Dispel when needed. Sheer Terror, which is the damage for your Psychic Stream, and the Petrifying Stream, the new talent, can kind of act as like a pseudo-stun. It's really a good combination to be able to have for Spiteful weeks. But we just got out of that, but it's something to kind of keep in mind going forward. Not a lot of areas that I think Dominate Mind works well, but I kind of hesitate to take Sheer Terror unless I'm taking Petrifying Stream as well, because otherwise some mobs can just get feared and run off to Timbuktu. Huge believer in Harsh Discipline, Expiation, the Squid. Overall, these feel really wonderful. I'm a huge fan of the longer Shadow Covenant duration, as we mentioned in the video. I just kind of struggle to figure out how I can take Twilight Equilibrium without giving up too much, as I think there's a lot of very powerful talents that we have in the tree at the moment for 5-mans and I am really, really excited to start seeing how they feel once I get a bit deeper into higher level keystones. So watch out for that this coming week. We're going to be doing a whole host of big keys on disc this week and seeing how the squid performs. If you have any questions or anything you want me to try out as we're sort of figuring things out before we have our official guide going, let me know in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you all found this useful and helpful, and I'll catch you all next time.